The $20 bill didn't fall loudly, but somehow the whole restaurant heard it hit the floor. Ethan Caldwell didn't even look down when he flicked it at her. He just leaned back, smirking, and said, "Pick it up, or prove you belong here." Then he raised the stakes, $300,000 if she could say one sentence in Chinese. 60 people watched. No one spoke. Not the manager, not the guests, not even the people who knew it was wrong. Just the quiet clink of silverware, and a woman standing there, being measured like she didn't matter. But Naomi Brooks didn't bend. She didn't argue. She didn't walk away. She just stood there, calm, steady, her fingers brushing against a worn black pen clipped to her apron. The only thing about her that seemed out of place in that room. Ethan thought he had already won. What he didn't know was that he had just bet $300,000 against something he couldn't see, something that had been quietly building for years. And before this night is over, that same room that stayed silent is going to stand up for her. The dining room glowed in soft amber light, the kind that made everything look warmer than it really was. Outside the tall glass windows, San Francisco Bay stretched into the night, black water broken only by scattered reflections of distant ships. Inside, the air carried the quiet rhythm of fine dining, silverware brushing porcelain, low voices folding into one another, the occasional clink of a wine glass catching the light. Naomi Brooks moved through it all like she always did, steady, quiet, invisible. Her black apron was neatly pressed, her white shirt crisp despite the long shift, her hair pulled back in a simple style that kept her face clear. She carried a tray balanced with practiced ease, weaving between tables without drawing attention, the way she'd learned to do after years of being in rooms where people didn't expect to see her. Table 14 sat near the windows. It was the kind of table that changed the way a room breathed. 6 people. Expensive suits. Controlled laughter. A bottle of wine that cost more than Naomi's rent. And at the head of it all, Ethan Caldwell, leaning back in his chair like the entire evening belonged to him. Naomi approached with a calm smile, placing a fresh glass of water beside one of the guests. She noticed the subtle shift in posture from the others as she arrived, shoulders tightening, conversations pausing for just a second too long. Ethan didn't look at her right away. He finished his sentence first, something about a waterfront deal and timelines, his voice smooth and practiced. Then, slowly, he turned his head, his eyes landing on Naomi like she had interrupted something important. "You're our server tonight?" he asked. Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir. My name is Naomi. I'll be taking care of you this evening." There was nothing uncertain in her voice. No apology, just calm professionalism. Ethan studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering in a way that made the space feel smaller. "I asked for someone who could handle international guests," he said, loud enough that the entire table and the nearby ones could hear. "Not this." The word hung unfinished, but it didn't need completion. A couple of the guests shifted in their seats. One of the men at the table glanced down at his plate. Another reached for his glass without drinking. Naomi felt it, that familiar tightening in her chest, the one she had learned to breathe through a long time ago. "I assure you, sir," she said evenly, "I'm fully capable of assisting your table." Ethan let out a short laugh, sharp and dry. "Capable?" he repeated. "You?" He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded bill, and flicked it with his thumb like it was nothing. The $20 bill hit the edge of the table, slid across the polished surface, and dropped to the floor at Naomi's feet. It landed softly. Too softly for the weight it carried. "Pick that up," Ethan said, leaning forward slightly, "and walk away. I'll get someone who actually belongs here." The room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough. The conversations at the nearest tables slowed. A fork paused halfway to someone's mouth. A woman at the bar turned her head just slightly, pretending not to look. No one said anything. Naomi lowered her gaze, not in submission, but in awareness. The bill lay there on the dark wood floor, just inches from her shoe. She could hear her own breathing, slow, controlled. She had been here before. Not this exact moment, not this exact room, but this feeling. Being measured in a single glance, being dismissed before she had the chance to exist. Across the table, one of the guests, an older man with silver at his temples, watched quietly, his expression unreadable. Ethan leaned back again, satisfied with the silence he had created. "Go on," he said. "That's more than you'd make in an hour, right?" There was a ripple of uncomfortable movement at the table. Still, no one spoke. Naomi didn't move. Her hands remained at her sides, fingers relaxed, her posture unchanged. She didn't bend. She didn't reach. Instead, her right hand lifted slightly, almost unconsciously, and brushed against the front of her apron. Her fingers found the familiar shape clipped there. A pen. Old. Worn. Black lacquer chipped near the clip. Along its side, faint characters had been etched years ago. Small, precise strokes that most people would never notice. Naomi's thumb rested over them for a brief second. Then she let her hand fall back to her side. "I'm assigned to this table," she said quietly. Not defensive. Not angry. Just a statement. Ethan's smile thinned. "Then maybe we should make this interesting," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry. He reached for his glass, swirling the amber liquid inside before setting it down again. "I'll make you a deal," he continued. $300,000. That number didn't belong in this room. It didn't belong in Naomi's world. It hung there anyway. "If you can say one sentence in Chinese," Ethan said, his eyes fixed on her. "Just one. I'll write you a check right now." A pause. "And if you can't," he added, his voice dropping into something colder, "you pick that up and get out of my sight." The silence deepened. Somewhere in the room, a glass clinked too loudly. Someone cleared their throat. A server near the kitchen door stood frozen, tray in hand. Naomi could feel every eye. Not on Ethan. On her. Waiting. Measuring. Deciding. She didn't look at the bill again. She didn't look at Ethan. For a moment her gaze shifted past him, toward the far side of the table, where the older man sat, still watching. Then she drew in a slow breath, and turned. Not toward the floor, not toward the money, but away from the table. Her steps were quiet against the wood as she walked back toward the kitchen, the soft glow of the dining room fading slightly with each step. Behind her, Ethan let out another laugh. "Guess that answers that," he said. A few people at the table forced small smiles. Most said nothing. Naomi reached the kitchen door and pushed it open just enough to slip inside. The noise of the kitchen, clattering pans, voices calling orders, wrapped around her like a different world. She stopped just past the threshold. Her hand moved again, this time deliberately, touching the pen clipped to her apron. For a second, her shoulders rose with a breath she didn't release right away. Then she exhaled slowly. Behind her, through the narrow gap in the door, the dining room continued as if nothing had happened. But something had. Naomi turned her head slightly, just enough to look back through the glass panel. Her eyes found table 14. The bill was still on the floor. Ethan was still smiling, and the room was still watching. Naomi didn't move. Not yet. Because something in her had shifted, and she hadn't decided what to do with it. Not yet. Not quite. The kitchen swallowed Naomi in a rush of noise and heat, like stepping into a different world that refused to acknowledge what had just happened 10 feet away. Pans clattered. Someone called out an order for salmon. Steam curled up from a line of sauté pans, carrying the scent of butter and garlic into the air. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed faintly, harsher than the soft amber glow of the dining room. But none of it reached her. Naomi stood just inside the door, one hand still resting against it, as if she hadn't fully decided whether she had entered or escaped. Behind her, muffled through the wood and glass, came the faint echo of laughter. Ethan. It cut through everything. She closed her eyes for a second. Not long. Just enough to steady the rhythm in her chest. Naomi. The voice came from her left. Derek. He was leaning against the stainless steel counter, a dish towel slung over his shoulder, his brow pulled tight in a way that told her he'd seen enough without needing to ask. I heard it, he said quietly. Of course he had. Everyone had. Naomi didn't turn right away. She kept her gaze forward, fixed on a spot on the far wall where a faded schedule was taped up, the corners curling. I'm fine, she said. It was automatic, clean, controlled. Derek let out a breath that sounded like it had been waiting. You don't have to be, he replied. She almost smiled at that. Almost. But the feeling didn't quite reach her face. Across the kitchen, a young prep cook, Maria, barely out of high school, stood frozen near the cutting board, her knife hovering above a half-chopped onion. She wasn't pretending not to watch. She didn't know how yet. Her eyes were locked on Naomi, wide and uncertain. Naomi noticed. She always noticed. And something in that look, something raw and unfiltered, pressed heavier than anything Ethan had said. Because it wasn't just about her. It never was. Derek pushed himself off the counter and stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. Look, he said. Guys like him, they're not worth it. You walk away, you finish your shift, you go home. That's how you win. Naomi finally turned her head. Is it? She asked. There was no challenge in it. Just a question. Derek hesitated. The answer he had didn't sound as solid when it had to be spoken out loud. Outside, through the small rectangular window in the kitchen door, the dining room still moved in that careful, controlled way, like nothing had been disturbed. But Naomi could feel it. That shift, like the air for a storm, when everything goes quiet but heavier. Her fingers moved again, almost on their own, brushing against the pen clipped to her apron. The metal was cool against her skin, worn smooth from years of use. She pressed her thumb lightly over the engraved characters. She didn't need to look at them. She knew them by memory. Derek followed the motion, his eyes flicking to the pen, then back to her face. You thinking about going back out there? He asked. Naomi didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped forward, deeper into the kitchen, then stopped again. It felt like standing at the edge of something. Behind her, a line cook slammed a pan down harder than necessary. Table 14's still waiting, someone muttered. A few heads turned, not openly, not boldly, but enough. The kitchen had its own version of silence. It wasn't quiet. It was avoidance. Naomi looked down at her hands. They were steady. They always were. That had taken years. Years of learning how to keep everything inside from spilling out where people could use it against her. She remembered a different kitchen. Smaller. Louder. The smell of frying oil soaked into the walls. Her mother standing at a stove, shoulders tight, telling her without turning around, you don't give people a show when they expect one. You give them nothing. Naomi had been 12. She hadn't understood then. She did now. Derek shifted his weight. Naomi, he said again, softer this time. Just don't let him drag you into something. She let out a slow breath. He already did, she said. Not angry, just honest. Maria set the knife down carefully, the soft tap of metal against wood sounding louder than it should. You don't have to go back, she said, her voice small but clear. Naomi looked at her. Really looked. There it was again. That reflection. That question without words. What do you do when they treat you like you don't belong? Naomi held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. Then she nodded once. Not to agree, to acknowledge. She turned back toward the door. Derek straightened. Hey, he said quickly, stepping in front of her just enough to slow her down, not enough to block her. Think about this. Whatever he's offering, whatever he's saying, it's not real. It's a game to him. Naomi met his eyes. I know, she said. Then why go back? Because walking away didn't feel like winning. Because that $20 bill was still on the floor. Because 60 people had watched and chosen silence. Because somewhere in that room, someone had decided what she was worth without asking a single question. But she didn't say any of that. She just looked at him. And in that look, Derek understood more than she could have explained. He stepped aside. Not because he agreed, because he knew she had already decided something he couldn't change. Naomi reached for the door. Her hand paused on the handle. Through the glass, she could see table 14 again. Ethan leaned back in his chair, relaxed, one arm draped casually over the backrest. He was talking, smiling, like the moment had already been erased. The older man, the one with the silver at his temples, sat still, his gaze drifting toward the door for just a fraction of a second. Their eyes almost met. Almost. Naomi's grip tightened slightly. Behind her, the kitchen noise carried on, indifferent. In front of her, the dining room waited. She could walk out the back, clock out early, disappear into the night like nothing had happened. That would be easier, cleaner, safer. Her thumb pressed once more against the pen. The engraved characters caught the light for just a second. She exhaled. Slow. Steady. Then she opened the door. Not all the way. Just enough to step through. The sound of the dining room returned, wrapping around her again. Quieter now, more aware. Heads turned. Not openly, but enough. Naomi took one step forward, then another. Not rushing, not hesitating. Each step measured, deliberate. Like someone who wasn't walking back into the same room she had left. Like someone who had decided something the room didn't know yet. At table 14, Ethan's voice faltered for half a beat when he noticed her approaching. Then the smile came back, wider this time. Look who's back, he said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone near the window leaned slightly closer. Naomi stopped 3 steps from the table, close enough to be part of it, far enough to still choose. She didn't look at the bill. She didn't look at Ethan. Her gaze moved past him, to the man who hadn't spoken, to the one who had been listening. And for the first time since she stepped back into the room, the silence felt different, not empty. Waiting. Naomi drew in a quiet breath, and the question hanging in the air wasn't whether she would leave. It was what she was about to say. Naomi didn't rush it. She let the silence stretch, just long enough for everyone in the room to feel it settle into their bones. The kind of silence that wasn't empty. The kind that pressed. Ethan leaned back in his chair, one hand resting loosely around his glass, watching her like he already knew the ending to this story. Go on, he said. his voice carrying just enough amusement to ripple across the nearby tables. "We're all waiting." A few quiet chuckles followed. Not from everyone. Just enough. Naomi didn't react. She stood there, steady, her posture relaxed but unyielding, as if the weight of the room wasn't something new to her. Across from Ethan, the older man, Mr. Liang, shifted slightly in his seat. It was subtle, barely noticeable. But Naomi saw it. His eyes were no longer drifting. They were focused. On her. To his right, a woman, elegant, composed, leaned closer to him and said something under her breath. 2 short sentences, soft, measured, in Mandarin. No one else at the table reacted. Ethan certainly didn't. He was still looking at Naomi, waiting for her to stumble into the trap he had laid out so confidently. But Naomi heard every word. She hadn't meant to. It had come through the room the way certain sounds do, clearer than they should be, cutting through layers of noise as if they belonged to her. She didn't move, didn't blink. She let the words settle in her mind, each tone precise, each meaning unfolding naturally, the way it always had. "This man talks about respect," the woman had said quietly, "but treats his own people like furniture." Mr. Liang didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. His silence carried more agreement than any reply could have. Naomi felt something shift inside her. Not anger. Not exactly. Something steadier than that. Something older. Behind her, somewhere near the bar, a glass was set down too hard. The sound echoed sharper than it should have, then faded quickly back into the hush. Ethan tapped his fingers lightly against the table. "Problem?" he asked, tilting his head just slightly. "Or are you trying to remember how to say hello?" Another small wave of laughter. Still, no one stepped in. No manager, no guest, no one. Naomi's gaze moved, just for a moment, to the floor. The $20 bill was still there, exactly where it had landed, untouched. It looked smaller now, less important, but somehow heavier. She drew in a quiet breath, then lifted her eyes again. This time she didn't look at Ethan. She looked at Mr. Liang. Directly. It was a simple shift, but it changed the shape of the moment. Mr. Liang noticed. His brows lifted just slightly, not in surprise but in recognition. Naomi took a step forward. Not into the space Ethan controlled, into the space between them. "I believe," she said slowly, her voice calm, measured, "there may have been a small misunderstanding about the timing of your shipment." The words were spoken in English, but her tone had changed. There was a clarity in it now, a precision. Ethan frowned. "That's not your concern," he said, his voice sharpening. "You're here to serve, not to—" Naomi didn't respond to him. She kept her attention on Mr. Liang, and then, without raising her voice, without changing her expression, she spoke again. This time in Mandarin. The language moved differently on her tongue. Not forced, not rehearsed, natural, fluid. Each word placed exactly where it needed to be. She repeated the concern the woman had raised, gently, respectfully, clarifying the point about timing, about delivery expectations, about a detail that had been overlooked in the conversation. The room didn't just go quiet. It stopped. Completely. Ethan's hand froze mid-gesture. The faint clink of ice in his glass, the only sound that dared to move. At the far end of the dining room, a server paused mid-step, tray hovering in the air. Derek, standing just inside the kitchen doorway, didn't blink. Mr. Liang leaned forward. Not much. Just enough. His eyes studied Naomi now with a different kind of attention. The kind that didn't dismiss. The kind that weighed. The woman beside him straightened slightly, her earlier composure giving way to something closer to curiosity. Naomi finished her sentence. Then she stopped. She didn't fill the silence. She didn't look around to measure the impact. She simply waited. Mr. Liang's lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. He glanced at Ethan, then back at Naomi, and for a moment, it felt like the entire evening had shifted onto a different axis. Ethan recovered first. Of course he did. He set his glass down with a controlled motion, the faintest edge of irritation slipping into his expression. Okay, he said, forcing a light laugh that didn't quite land. Cute. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table now. A sentence, he continued. You memorized a sentence. That's impressive. A few people at the table nodded, eager to return to something familiar, something safe. But Mr. Liang didn't nod. He didn't smile. He didn't look away from Naomi. Instead, he spoke. In Mandarin. Slowly. Clearly. A question. Simple on the surface, but layered. Testing. The kind of question that couldn't be answered with a memorized line. Naomi listened. Every word. Every inflection. She didn't interrupt. Didn't rush. She let him finish. Behind her, the room held its breath again. Not out of discomfort this time. Out of something else. Something closer to anticipation. Ethan watched her closely now, the amusement in his eyes thinning into something sharper. He knew enough to understand the difference between performance and reality. And for the first time that night, he wasn't entirely sure which one he was watching. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Just a fraction. Then she answered. In Mandarin. Not just the words, the meaning behind them. Clear, precise, unforced. She didn't stumble, didn't hesitate. She spoke the way someone does when the language isn't something they learned, but something they lived. Mr. Liang's expression changed. It was subtle, but undeniable. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus. The woman beside him exchanged a quick glance with him, something unspoken passing between them. At the edge of the room, someone whispered. Another person leaned closer to see. The silence had transformed. It wasn't avoidance anymore. It was attention. Ethan's jaw tightened. Just a little. But enough. He leaned back again, slower this time. Well, he said, his voice quieter now, more controlled. That's unexpected. No one laughed. Not this time. Naomi let the moment settle. Then she stepped back half a pace, not retreating, rebalancing. The $20 bill was still on the floor, but no one was looking at it anymore, not even Ethan. And somewhere in that shift, something had already begun to change, but not enough. Not yet. Because now the room had a different question. Not whether Naomi could speak, but how much she understood, and how far this moment was about to go. The question didn't belong to Ethan anymore. It belonged to the room. Naomi could feel it shift, quiet, but undeniable. The air had weight now, not the heavy kind that pressed people down, but the kind that held them still, waiting for something they couldn't yet name. Ethan tapped his fingers once against the table, the sound sharper than before. All right, he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. That's 2 sentences. Maybe 3 if we're being generous. He leaned back again, stretching his arm across the back of his chair, like he was settling into something he still believed he controlled. But let's not confuse this, he added. This isn't a conversation. This is a parlor trick. A few nods, a few quick glances. People wanted that to be true. It made things easier. Naomi didn't respond to him. She stood exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her gaze still resting on Mr. Liang. There was no defiance in her expression, no challenge, just presence. Mr. Liang studied her for a long moment, then spoke again, this time not to test, not to provoke, but to clarify. His words came slower now, more deliberate, touching on a detail from the earlier conversation. Something about timing, about delivery, about a condition buried beneath the surface of what had been discussed so far. Naomi listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to answer. She let him finish. Then she answered, just as calmly. Her voice in Mandarin carried a different rhythm now, not just accurate, but thoughtful. She wasn't repeating. She was interpreting, adjusting, bridging something that had been slightly off without making it obvious. At the edge of the table, one of the guests shifted forward in his seat, elbows resting lightly against the tablecloth. The woman beside Mr. Liang turned her head fully toward Naomi now, no longer pretending to stay out of it. Ethan's smile tightened. That's enough, he said, cutting in. You've made your point, but Naomi hadn't been trying to make one. That was the difference. She stepped back slightly, giving the table space again. I just wanted to make sure everyone was understanding each other correctly, she said, now in English, her tone unchanged. It was simple, neutral, but it landed differently, because now everyone knew she could have said more. Ethan let out a breath through his nose, a quiet sign of irritation slipping through his control. You're overstepping, he said. That's not your role. Naomi met his gaze for the first time since she had returned. There was no heat in it, no anger, just clarity. My role, she said, is to serve the table. The words were the same ones she had used earlier, but they meant something else now. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Mr. Liang spoke again, this time in English. Let her continue, he said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The authority in it settled over the table immediately. Ethan paused, just for a fraction of a second, but long enough for everyone to notice. Naomi felt it. That shift. Small, but real. She didn't move into it, didn't claim it. She simply acknowledged it with the slightest nod. Across the room, Derek had stepped closer to the kitchen doorway, his hand resting against the frame as if he needed something solid to hold onto. Maria stood just behind him, her eyes fixed on Naomi, not blinking. At the bar, the bartender slowed his movements, polishing a glass that didn't need polishing. The room had stopped pretending not to watch. Naomi turned her attention back to the table. To clarify, she said gently, addressing Mr. Liang, there may have been a misunderstanding about how the delivery schedule aligns with your expectations. She paused, choosing her words carefully, not just translating, interpreting. In the current structure, she continued, the timeline assumes flexibility that may not actually exist once everything is in motion. She didn't look at Ethan when she said it. She didn't need to. Mr. Liang leaned back slightly, considering. Then he glanced at Ethan. A simple look. But it carried a question. Ethan straightened. That's not accurate, he said quickly. Our team accounted for every variable. Naomi didn't respond immediately. She let the silence return. Let the weight of his certainty settle against the uncertainty that had just been introduced. Then she spoke again, her voice still calm. There's a clause, she said, in the agreement structure you described earlier. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. I didn't describe any clauses, he said. Naomi tilted her head just a fraction. "No," she said. "You didn't." The words hung there, soft but precise. A flicker of something crossed Ethan's face. Not fear, not yet, but something closer to awareness. Naomi continued, still addressing Mr. Liang. "The way it's currently framed," she said, "leaves room for interpretation, especially on your side." Mr. Liang's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "How so?" he asked. The question wasn't casual anymore. It was focused. Naomi felt the attention of the entire room shift again, tightening around that single exchange. She could hear the faint hum of the lights overhead, the distant roll of a car passing outside, the soft, steady rhythm of her own breath. She glanced, just for a second, at the pen on her apron, then back up. "It depends on how the language is understood," she said. A pause. Then, in Mandarin, she explained. Carefully, step by step, not simplifying, not performing, just laying out the idea the way it existed. As she spoke, something changed at the table. The casual posture disappeared. The small gestures stopped. Even the sound of glass against wood faded into the background. Mr. Liang's wife leaned forward, her attention fully engaged now. The other guests exchanged quick glances. Ethan didn't move. He sat very still, watching Naomi with a focus that hadn't been there before. When she finished, she stepped back again, just enough to return the space to them. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Full of calculation, of reconsideration, of something shifting beneath the surface that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Mr. Liang spoke quietly to his wife again. Short, measured. This time, Naomi didn't need to listen. She already knew what had changed. Ethan picked up his glass, but he didn't drink. His hand tightened slightly around it. "Let's not get carried away," he said, his voice lower now, more controlled. "We're here to discuss business, not—" "Exactly," Mr. Liang said, cutting him off. The word landed clean, without effort, and just like that, the balance tipped. Not completely, not yet, but enough that everyone in the room felt it. Naomi stood there, steady as ever, her hands at her sides. The $20 bill was still on the floor, but it no longer felt like the center of anything. Something else had taken its place. Something quieter. Something stronger. And for the first time that night, the room wasn't waiting to see if Naomi would fail. It was waiting to see what she would do next. Naomi didn't rush to fill it. She let the silence stay where it was, balanced, fragile, stretched across the table like glass that hadn't cracked yet, but might at any second. Mr. Liang's gaze remained on her, steady, thoughtful. Ethan shifted in his chair. Not dramatically, just enough to remind himself and everyone else that this was still his table. "Let's keep this on track," he said, his voice smoother now, but thinner. "We're here to close a deal, not explore hidden talents." A few people at the table gave small nods, grateful for something familiar to hold on to. Naomi didn't look at him. Instead, she reached for the wine bottle resting near the center of the table. Her movement was calm, professional, as if nothing unusual had happened. "May I?" she asked, her tone gentle. Mr. Liang gave a small nod. Naomi poured the wine slowly, the deep red liquid catching the warm light as it filled each glass. The soft sound of it landing against crystal seemed louder now, sharper, like the room had turned up its sensitivity to everything. She set the bottle down carefully. Then, just before stepping back, she spoke again. In Mandarin. Not to correct, not to challenge, but to offer. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. She addressed Mr. Liang directly, referencing a detail from earlier in the conversation, something Ethan had mentioned in passing, something that had been brushed over too quickly. A condition, a timeline, a point that seemed minor, unless you understood what it meant from the other side. Naomi adjusted it. Not the deal, the understanding of it. She clarified how the phrasing might sound to someone hearing it in Mandarin, how certain assumptions didn't translate cleanly, how a sentence that felt flexible in English could feel rigid, almost final, when heard the way Mr. Liang's team would hear it. She didn't say Ethan was wrong. She didn't need to. Mr. Liang's expression shifted first, then his wife's, then the two associates sitting across from them. It moved like a ripple, subtle, but undeniable. Ethan's smile didn't collapse. It thinned. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked, his voice lower now, controlled, but edged. Naomi turned to him. For a moment, their eyes met. "I'm making sure your guests understand what's being offered," she said. Her tone didn't rise, didn't sharpen. It stayed where it had been all along. Steady. Ethan let out a short breath through his nose. "They understand just fine," he said. "They've been doing business longer than you've been alive, so." Naomi nodded once. "I'm sure they have," she replied. Then she turned back to Mr. Liang and continued. This time she didn't just translate, she bridged. She took a phrase Ethan had used earlier, something about moving quickly and locking things in, and reshaped it into something that carried respect instead of pressure. In Mandarin, she softened the edges, not changing the meaning, just the weight of it. Mr. Liang listened closely. When she finished, he responded, not to Ethan, but to Naomi. A short sentence. Curious, testing something deeper now. Naomi answered without hesitation. Her words came naturally, the rhythm of them unforced, like stepping into a space she already knew how to move in. At the far end of the room, someone leaned closer to their companion, whispering. Near the bar, a man set his drink down without taking a sip. Derek's grip tightened slightly on the kitchen doorframe. The room wasn't just watching anymore. It was following. Ethan's fingers curled slightly against the table. "You're overstepping," he said again, but the certainty in his voice had shifted. It wasn't a command now. It was a warning. Naomi didn't respond to the warning. She responded to the moment. Mr. Liang asked another question. Longer this time, more detailed. Naomi listened carefully, her head tilting just slightly as she processed each part. Then she answered. Not quickly, not slowly. At exactly the pace the question required. She broke it down, clarified the nuance, explained how a specific term could be interpreted differently depending on context, and how that difference might affect expectations on both sides. She didn't look at Ethan once while she spoke, but everyone else did. Because this wasn't about a single sentence anymore. This was about understanding, real understanding. And it was becoming clear, uncomfortably clear, that Naomi had more of it than anyone had expected. When she finished, the silence that followed wasn't fragile. It was full. Mr. Liang leaned back slightly, considering her words. Then he spoke again, in English this time. "You are saying," he began slowly, "that the structure of the agreement may be misunderstood." Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir." He glanced at Ethan. "Is that correct?" Ethan sat very still. For a moment, he didn't answer. His jaw tightened just enough to be seen. "It's been reviewed," he said finally, "by professionals." Naomi didn't contradict him. She didn't need to, because Mr. Liang wasn't looking at Ethan anymore. He was looking at her. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. The question landed softly, but it carried weight. Naomi paused. Just for a second. Her hand moved again, brushing lightly against the pen on her apron. I've spent some time around it, she said. It was true, just not complete. Mr. Liang studied her a moment longer, then nodded once. Across the table, Ethan picked up his glass and took a drink, a longer one this time. The ice shifted against the sides, the sound sharper than before. When he set it down, his fingers lingered on the rim. This is getting out of hand, he said, his voice quieter now, but harder. We're not here to be corrected by staff. The word landed differently now. Staff. Not waitress. Not her name. Just a category. But it didn't carry the same power it had earlier, because the room had already seen something it couldn't unsee. Naomi stepped back again, not retreating, recentering. I apologize if I've overstepped, she said. And for a brief second, it sounded like she might step away again, like she might let the moment close, like she might return everything to the way it had been. Ethan leaned back slightly, the edge of his confidence returning. That would be best, he said. But Naomi didn't move, not toward the kitchen, not toward the door. Instead, she reached for the edge of the table, not touching it. Just placing her hand close enough to steady herself. And then she spoke again. This time not to soften anything, not to clarify, but to point. There's one more thing, she said. Her voice was still calm, still measured, but something had shifted beneath it. Something firmer. Mr. Liang's attention sharpened. Ethan's expression tightened. Naomi glanced briefly at the glass of water near the center of the table, the reflection of the overhead lights trembling across its surface. Then she looked up, at Mr. Liang, and spoke in Mandarin once more. But this time the words weren't about tone, or phrasing, or perception. They were about something deeper, something structural, something that hadn't been said out loud yet. And as the first few words left her mouth, the room leaned in, whether it meant to or not. Because whatever she was about to reveal wasn't small, and it wasn't going to be easy to ignore. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The words she spoke in Mandarin were measured, deliberate, each one placed with the kind of care that comes from knowing exactly how much weight it carries. She described the issue simply. A structural inconsistency, not obvious, not dramatic, but real. A gap between what had been presented and what had actually been implied. She didn't accuse. She didn't point. She just laid it out. And as she spoke, something in the room shifted again, this time deeper, quieter, more unsettling. Mr. Liang's posture changed first. He leaned forward, elbows resting lightly against the table, his attention now fully locked on Naomi. The polite distance he had maintained earlier disappeared. The woman beside him turned her body slightly toward Naomi, no longer angled toward Ethan. Across the table, one of the associates reached for his phone, not to check it, but to pull up something, his brow tightening. Naomi continued. She explained how a single phrase, when interpreted through Mandarin business convention, could carry a different implication than intended. How a clause that seemed flexible in English could be understood as binding in another context. She paused briefly, then added gently, depending on how it's read. It could create an expectation that may not align with your current structure. She stepped back half a pace, giving the table room to breathe. But no one moved. No one reached for their glass. No one broke the silence. Because now the silence wasn't about discomfort. It was about processing. Mr. Liang spoke quietly to his wife again. This time the tone was different, lower, more focused. She responded with a short sentence, her expression sharpening as she spoke. The associate on the far end nodded once, eyes still on his phone. Ethan didn't look at them. He looked at Naomi. Really looked this time. Not at her uniform. Not at the role he had assigned her, at her. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice controlled, but tighter now. Naomi met his gaze. "For clarity," she said, "I'm suggesting that there may be a difference in interpretation." Ethan's jaw shifted slightly. "There is no difference," he said. "Everything has been reviewed." "I understand," Naomi replied. And she did. That was the problem. Mr. Liang leaned back slowly, then reached for his glass, not to drink but to hold it, turning it slightly between his fingers. He looked at Ethan. "Your team reviewed this?" he asked. The question was simple, but it didn't land that way. Ethan nodded once. "Yes." A pause. Then Mr. Liang glanced back at Naomi. "Explain it again," he said. Not to Ethan, to her. The shift was subtle, but it was absolute. Naomi felt it settle into place. She didn't hesitate. This time she spoke in English, not because she needed to, but because everyone needed to understand. She broke it down carefully. No jargon, no unnecessary detail, just the core of it. "If the language stays as it is," she said, "it leaves room for your partners to interpret the agreement in a way that limits your flexibility later." She gestured lightly toward the table, not pointing at anyone, just indicating the space between them. "And if that happens," she added, "you may find yourselves locked into terms you didn't intend to commit to." The words didn't come fast. They didn't need to. They landed, one by one. Ethan's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. "That's not how it works," he said. But the certainty was thinner now. Naomi didn't argue. She simply looked at Mr. Liang. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he turned to his associate, who was already scrolling through something on his phone. A document, something familiar. The associate murmured a few words in Mandarin, his tone low but urgent. Mr. Liang listened, then nodded once, slow, deliberate. And when he looked back at Naomi, there was something new in his expression. Not curiosity, not surprise, respect. Ethan saw it, and that's when it hit him. Not fully, not all at once, but enough. Enough to realize that this wasn't about a waitress stepping out of line. This was about something else entirely. He leaned forward again, this time placing both hands flat on the table. "Let's not lose perspective here," he said, his voice firm, pushing for control. "We're talking about a complex agreement. You can't just—" "She's right." The words came from Mr. Liang. Clear, unhurried, final. The room didn't just go quiet. It dropped, like something had been pulled out from under it. Ethan stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still slightly open, his hands still pressed against the table. For a second, he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. The associate at the end of the table nodded again, more firmly this time. "We noted this last week," he added quietly in English. "It was not addressed." Naomi didn't react. She didn't shift. She didn't look around to measure the impact. She simply stood where she was. Still. Composed. Like this moment didn't belong to her. Like she hadn't just changed the direction of the entire conversation. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair. The movement was controlled, but the shift in him was not. His confidence hadn't disappeared. But it had cracked. Just enough to let something else show through. Something uncertain. Around the room, people began to move again, but differently now. Not avoiding, observing. At the bar, a man shook his head slightly, almost to himself. Near the window, a couple exchanged a quiet look. Derek let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maria's hands were clasped together tightly in front of her, her eyes wide. The room had changed, and everyone knew it. Naomi glanced, just briefly, at the floor. The $20 bill was still there, but it didn't feel like an insult anymore. It felt like something else. A marker of where this had started, and how far it had already gone. She looked back up. Mr. Liang was still watching her, and for the first time, he wasn't just listening. He was considering, not whether she belonged in the room, but what role she might play in it. Ethan followed that gaze. From Mr. Liang to Naomi, and back again. And in that exchange, something became clear. The balance hadn't just shifted, it had started to move away from him. Not completely, not yet, but enough to make one thing impossible to ignore. He was no longer the only one controlling the outcome of this night. And that realization sat heavier than anything Naomi had said. Because it meant the conversation wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the room. And the room was starting to listen to someone else. Not loudly, not all at once, but in small, undeniable ways. A chair shifted closer to the table. A glass went untouched. A conversation at the next booth faded into silence mid-sentence. It wasn't that people had chosen Naomi. It was that they could no longer ignore her. Ethan felt it before he fully understood it. That slow, uncomfortable realization that something invisible had slipped out of his control. He straightened in his chair again, adjusting his cuff like the movement itself might reset the room. "We're done with this," he said, firmer now, projecting authority back into his voice. "Let's get back to the numbers." But no one moved. Not immediately. Mr. Liang remained still, his fingers lightly resting against the stem of his glass. His gaze drifted, not away from Naomi, but deeper into thought. The associate at the end of the table tapped his phone once more, then turned the screen slightly so Mr. Liang could see. A document, highlighted, marked. Something had been found. Naomi didn't lean in, didn't try to see. She already knew. Ethan noticed the motion. His eyes flicked to the phone, then back to Naomi, narrowing slightly. "What exactly did you see?" he asked. The question wasn't for the table. It was for her. Naomi held his gaze for a brief moment, then answered carefully. "There's a section," she said, her voice even, "that connects your delivery schedule to a conditional review." Ethan frowned. "That's standard," he said quickly. "It protects both sides." Naomi nodded once. "Yes," she said, "if both sides understand it the same way." A pause. Then she continued. "In Mandarin," she added, "the phrasing suggests something more fixed than conditional." The words settled. Not dramatic, but precise. Mr. Liang's associate spoke again, this time more clearly. "She's referring to subsection 3, he said in English, glancing between Naomi and Ethan. "We raised this last week." The air tightened. Ethan's expression didn't break, but something behind it shifted. "That was addressed," he said. The associate shook his head slightly. "It was acknowledged," he replied. "Not resolved." The distinction landed harder than it sounded. Naomi didn't add to it. She didn't need to. The space between what had been said and what had been proven was already wide enough. Across the table, Mr. Liang finally spoke again. "In our interpretation," he said slowly, "this clause limits flexibility after initial commitment." He looked at Ethan. "That was not your intention." Ethan held his gaze. "It was not," he said. Another pause. Then Mr. Liang turned back to Naomi. "And yet," he said, "this is how it reads." Naomi inclined her head slightly. Yes, sir. The room didn't breathe. It held. Because now the issue wasn't theoretical. It wasn't about language. It was about consequence. Ethan's fingers tightened against the table again. He reached for his glass, lifted it, then set it back down without drinking. Fine, he said. We'll revise the wording. He tried to make it sound small, manageable, something already under control. But the room didn't accept it that way, because it hadn't come from him. It had come from her. And everyone knew it. Naomi felt the shift ripple outward. Not loud, not visible, but real. At the edge of the room, someone exhaled softly. Near the bar, a man leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms as if settling in to watch something unfold. Derek stepped fully into the doorway now, no longer pretending to stay hidden. Maria stood just behind him, her hands pressed together near her chest. Naomi stood where she was, still, grounded. Her presence no longer something the room worked around, but something it worked with. Ethan saw it, and for the first time that night, something close to frustration broke through his control. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be, he said, his voice sharper now. This is a business negotiation, not a language seminar. Naomi turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. It's both, she said. Simple, direct, true. Ethan let out a short laugh, but it didn't carry. Right, he said, because now you're the expert. Naomi didn't answer that. Instead, she looked at Mr. Liang. There's one more part, she said. The words landed differently this time, because now the room understood what they might mean. Mr. Liang's attention sharpened again. Go on, he said. Naomi hesitated. Not from uncertainty, from choice, because this next piece wasn't just a clarification. It was a reveal. Something deeper. Something that hadn't been spoken out loud yet. She glanced, just briefly, at the pen on her apron. Her thumb brushed over the engraved characters, a quiet reminder. Then she looked up again. At the end of the clause, she said slowly, There's a phrase that appears neutral in English. Ethan's eyes narrowed. What phrase? He asked. Naomi didn't look at him. She spoke in Mandarin again, quoting it. Exactly. The tone, the structure, the weight of it. And as the words left her mouth, something in Mr. Liang's expression changed. Not gradually, immediately. His posture straightened, his gaze sharpened, his fingers stilled completely against the glass. The associate at the end of the table leaned forward quickly, his phone forgotten for the first time. The woman beside Mr. Liang drew in a quiet breath, because they all heard it now. Clearly, fully. The phrase didn't just imply a condition, it implied a boundary, a limit, something far more restrictive than what Ethan had presented. Naomi finished the sentence, then translated it. Not loosely, not generally. Exactly. In this form, she said quietly, it could be understood as binding beyond the initial agreement. The words settled into the room like something heavy, something that couldn't be pushed aside. Ethan didn't speak. For a moment, he couldn't. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a flaw, a real one. And it had been exposed, not by his team, not by his partners, but by someone he had told to pick up a $20 bill and leave. The irony didn't need to be stated. It filled the space on its own. Mr. Liang leaned back slowly, his eyes never leaving Naomi. Then he nodded once, deliberate, measured. She is correct, he said. The words landed clean, final. And just like that, the last thread of control Ethan had been holding onto slipped. Not completely, but enough. Enough for everyone to feel it. Naomi stepped back again, returning the space, returning the focus, as if she had only done what was necessary, and nothing more. The $20 bill was still on the floor. But now it looked different, smaller, lighter, almost irrelevant. Because something else had taken its place, something no one in that room could ignore anymore. The question wasn't whether Naomi belonged at the table, it was how they had failed to see it. And more importantly, what else they had missed. The question didn't stay in the room. It followed Naomi, not in words, in weight, in the way people looked at her now, not through her, not past her, but at her like something had come into focus that had been there all along. Naomi felt it, but she didn't absorb it. Not yet. Because the room was only seeing the surface of something much deeper. And that deeper part didn't belong to them. Not completely. Not yet. Mr. Liang leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together now, his eyes still fixed on Naomi. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. Naomi held his gaze. "For a while," she said. Her voice was quiet, honest, but careful. Ethan let out a short breath, something between a laugh and disbelief. "Of course she has," he muttered. "Everyone's got a story." But no one followed him. No one laughed this time, because the room wasn't interested in dismissing her anymore. It was trying to understand her. And Naomi could feel that shift, pulling at something she had kept closed for a long time. She didn't move right away. Instead, her hand drifted again to the pen on her apron. Her thumb traced the worn edge of it, the chipped lacquer, the faint engraving. A memory sat inside that small object, one she hadn't opened in years. "You said," Mr. Liang continued, his tone softer now, "you learned this by being around it." Naomi nodded slightly. "That's right." He studied her for a moment longer. Then he asked the question that changed everything. "Where?" It was simple, but it carried weight. Because it wasn't about language anymore. It was about origin. Naomi glanced at the table, at the glasses, at the folded napkins, at the quiet attention of people who had spent most of the night deciding what she was worth without ever asking. Then she looked back at him. "Chinatown," she said. The word settled into the room differently than anything else she had said. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't polished. But it was real. Ethan leaned back again, shaking his head slightly. "You picked up business Mandarin waiting tables?" he asked, the skepticism back in his voice, but thinner now, less certain. Naomi didn't answer him directly, because the truth didn't fit neatly into what he understood. "It wasn't a classroom," she said. And just like that, something shifted again. The room didn't disappear, but it faded, replaced for a moment by something else, a different space, a different life. The memory came quietly, not as a story she chose to tell, as something she had lived. A small grocery store on Stockton Street, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, stacks of produce in plastic crates, the air thick with the scent of ginger and dried fish. Naomi, younger, sitting on an overturned milk crate behind the counter, a notebook open in her lap. Her grandmother's voice in the background, greeting customers, moving through the store with a kind of tired grace that came from years of doing the same work without complaint. The women behind the fish counter arguing in Cantonese, fast, sharp, alive, a radio playing Mandarin talk shows in the back, the voices blending into everything else until they became part of the air. Naomi listening, not trying, not studying, just absorbing. Day after day, year after year, because there was nowhere else to be. She blinked once, and the restaurant came back. The warm light, the polished table, the quiet attention. I didn't learn it all at once, she said. No one interrupted. I listened, she added, for a long time. Her voice didn't change, but something in it deepened. Mr. Liang nodded slowly, as if that made more sense than anything else she could have said. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He was watching her differently now, not dismissing, not quite accepting either, trying to place her somewhere that still made sense. But the categories he was used to weren't working anymore. You're telling me, he said finally, that you just picked this up? Naomi met his eyes. No, she said. A pause, then gently, I stayed with it. The distinction hung there, clear, unavoidable. Across the table, Mr. Liang's wife leaned forward slightly. There's more, she said quietly. Not a challenge, an observation. Naomi hesitated, just for a second. Because there was more. But more meant opening something she had learned to keep closed, not out of shame, out of necessity. The room waited, not impatient, expectant. Naomi let out a slow breath. I used to help people, she said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. With forms, she added. Documents, medical paperwork, anything that needed translation. She didn't elaborate. She didn't list credentials. She didn't turn it into something impressive. Because it hadn't been. It had been normal. Every day. Necessary. But as she spoke, the room filled in the gaps. Elderly residents, confused by systems they couldn't navigate. Families caught between languages. Moments where understanding meant the difference between getting help and being turned away. Naomi had stood in those spaces, quietly, without recognition, without payment most of the time, because someone had to. Derek swallowed hard at the kitchen doorway. Maria's eyes were wide, not with surprise but with something closer to admiration. Ethan shifted again. This time there was no laughter behind it. Then why are you here? He asked. The question came out before he could stop it. Not sharp, not cruel, just confused. Naomi didn't take offense. She understood the question, because she had asked it herself, more than once. My mother got sick, she said. The words landed softer than anything else she had said that night. No tension, no edge, just truth. I needed something steady. A pause. And this was, silence followed. But it wasn't the same silence from before. This one held something else, something human. Mr. Liang nodded slowly, not in agreement, in recognition. Ethan looked down at the table for a moment, then back at her. The pieces were starting to come together. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to make the situation feel different than it had just minutes ago. Naomi stepped back slightly, her posture returning to neutral. She didn't push the moment further. She didn't try to claim anything from it. Because this wasn't about proving herself. It never had been. But something had changed anyway. The room wasn't just seeing what she could do. It was beginning to understand who she was. And that understanding carried weight far beyond language. Mr. Liang rested his hands on the table again. Then, quietly, "Will you stay?" he asked. The question was simple, but it wasn't about service anymore. Naomi looked at him, then at the table, then briefly, at the pen on her apron. Her thumb brushed over it once more, the worn engraving catching the light. She nodded. "Yes, sir." And just like that, the night shifted again. Not with noise, not with drama, but with something deeper. Because Naomi Brooks was no longer standing at the edge of the table. She was part of it. And whatever came next would not be the same as what came before. Naomi stepped forward again, not as a server returning to her position, not as someone filling a gap, but as someone the table had already begun to rely on. The shift was subtle in movement, but unmistakable in meaning. She no longer stood at the edge, she stood within the circle. Mr. Liang gestured lightly toward the open space beside him. "Please," he said, "stay here. Not an order, not even a request in the traditional sense. An invitation, one that carried weight far beyond the table." Naomi nodded once and moved closer, not sitting, not taking a seat that wasn't hers, but positioning herself where she could see everyone clearly, where everyone could see her. Ethan watched it happen, every inch of it. His fingers rested flat against the table, unmoving now, as if any motion might confirm something he wasn't ready to accept. "You don't need," he began. But he didn't finish. Because Mr. Liang had already turned away from him. Not dismissively, decisively. The conversation resumed, but not the way it had before. Mr. Liang spoke in Mandarin, longer this time, more detailed. Not testing, not probing, discussing. His wife added a point, her tone measured but firm. One of the associates leaned in, referencing something from the document again, his words quick but precise. Naomi listened. All of it. Every thread, every nuance. She didn't rush to speak. She let them finish. Then, in English, she responded, not word for word, but meaning for meaning. She carried the weight of what they had said across the language, adjusting where needed, clarifying where necessary, smoothing the edges that might cause friction. Ethan sat there, listening. For the first time that night, he wasn't leading the conversation. He was following it. And worse, he was following it through her. Naomi turned slightly toward him. "They're asking about the flexibility in phase 2, she said. Her tone was neutral, professional, as if this had always been her role. Ethan nodded once too quickly. "We've already covered that," he said. Naomi translated, but she didn't repeat his words exactly. She shaped them, adjusted the tone, softened the certainty just enough to match the way the question had been asked. Mr. Liang responded. Naomi listened, then turned back to Ethan. "They're concerned about how the timeline might affect local approvals," she said. Ethan exhaled slowly. "That won't be an issue," he replied. Naomi translated again. This time she added a brief clarification, just a few words, about how the process typically works in San Francisco, not contradicting him, completing him. Mr. Liang nodded. The tension at the table eased slightly, but only slightly, because now the conversation had depth, and Naomi was the one holding it together. Across the room, people had stopped pretending entirely. Heads were turned openly now. A couple near the window had abandoned their meal altogether, their attention fixed on the table. At the bar, two men leaned closer, speaking in low voices, but never taking their eyes off what was happening. Derek stepped out of the kitchen doorway fully, standing just along the wall, arms crossed loosely, his gaze steady. Maria stood beside him now, no longer hiding. Naomi continued. Each exchange flowed through her, not just translated, understood. When Mr. Liang used a phrase that carried more weight than it appeared, Naomi let that weight come through in English. When Ethan responded with something that might sound too direct, Naomi softened it just enough to keep the tone balanced. She wasn't changing the conversation. She was guiding it, quietly, precisely, and the effect was immediate. Mr. Liang leaned forward more often now. His wife asked more questions. The associates took notes. The conversation became fluid, alive, real. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. How could he not? The deal he had been struggling to move forward all evening was moving. Because of her. He reached for his glass again, this time actually taking a sip, the liquid settling something in his throat that words could not. His eyes drifted to Naomi, then to Mr. Liang, then back again. And in that loop, something uncomfortable took shape. Dependency. He didn't like it, didn't want it. But it was there. Naomi turned to him once more. They'd like to understand your position on environmental adjustments, she said. Ethan blinked. For a split second, he hesitated. Then he answered, carefully this time, choosing his words with more attention than before. Naomi listened, then translated, again, adjusting the tone just enough to match the room. Mr. Liang nodded slowly. That is reasonable, he said. The words landed clean, solid. A step forward. Naomi felt it, the shift in momentum, the way the conversation had changed direction without anyone announcing it. She didn't react. She simply continued. Because this wasn't about her, not in the way the room might have thought. This was about making something work, making something understood. The irony didn't escape anyone watching. Not really. The woman who had been told to pick up a $20 bill and leave was now the only reason this conversation was still standing. Ethan's hand tightened slightly around his glass. He set it down again, slower this time. His jaw moved as if he wanted to say something, anything, to reclaim the space. But there was nothing to say that wouldn't break what had already begun. So he stayed quiet. And that silence spoke louder than anything he had said all night. Naomi glanced down for just a moment. The $20 bill was still there, unmoved, untouched. But it no longer felt like a challenge. It felt like something left behind, something smaller than the moment that had grown around it. She looked back up. The table was engaged, focused, connected in a way it hadn't been before, and she was at the center of it. Not by force, not by demand, but by presence. Mr. Liang spoke again, this time with a faint smile touching the edge of his expression. You understand both sides, he said. Naomi met his gaze. I try to, she replied. He nodded. That is rare. The words settled into the space between them. Ethan heard them. Everyone did. And in that moment, the room didn't just recognize Naomi's skill. It acknowledged her value. The shift was complete. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. The balance had moved, and it wasn't moving back. Not tonight, not anymore, because the table had already decided something without saying it out loud. If this deal was going to work, it was going to work through her. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled into Ethan Caldwell slowly, like something unwelcome finding its place in a room it didn't belong in. He could feel it in the way the conversation moved, in the pauses that no longer waited for him, in the eyes that shifted past him toward Naomi before every answer. It wasn't loud, it wasn't declared, but it was happening, and he hated it. Naomi stood where she had been, steady, composed, her presence now part of the structure of the table itself. Every word passed through her, every meaning shaped by her understanding. She didn't take control. She made control possible. Mr. Liang spoke again, this time with more ease in his voice. The guarded tone from earlier had softened. There was a rhythm now, a flow that hadn't existed when Ethan had been forcing the conversation forward. Naomi listened, translated, adjusted. Ethan answered when prompted, but he wasn't leading. He was reacting. And every time Naomi turned slightly toward him, repeating a question or clarifying a point, there was a subtle shift, like she was holding the bridge, and he had to cross it carefully. Across the room, the audience had grown. Not in number, in attention. People were no longer pretending to focus on their meals. Forks rested untouched. Glasses sat half full. Conversations had faded into whispers, then into nothing at all. The entire restaurant had leaned toward one table, toward one moment, toward one person. Ethan reached for his glass again. This time his hand lingered longer than before. He took a slow drink, letting the burn settle in his throat, grounding himself in something familiar. Control. He needed control back. He set the glass down carefully. Too carefully. "Let's move forward," he said, his voice firm again, sharper now. "We've spent enough time on minor details." Naomi translated, but she didn't soften that. She let the words land exactly as they were. Mr. Liang's expression shifted, just slightly. But enough. He responded in Mandarin, his tone no longer as open as it had been moments ago. Naomi listened, then turned to Ethan. "He says," she began calmly, "that details are where agreements are either built or broken." The words hung in the air. Clean. Unavoidable. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm aware of that," he said. Naomi translated. Again, without adjustment. This time, the sharpness carried through. Mr. Liang leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table. A pause. Then he spoke again. Longer. More deliberate. Naomi listened carefully. There was something different in this question. Something heavier. She turned to Ethan. "They're asking," she said, "how many times your team has revised the agreement since last week?" Ethan blinked. "Once, a small thing. But visible." "That's not relevant," he said quickly. Naomi didn't move. "They're asking," she repeated, "because they want to understand how stable the terms are." Ethan exhaled. Slow, measured. "3 times," he said. Naomi translated. This time, there was no need to adjust tone. The number spoke for itself. Across the table, the associate who had been reviewing the document nodded slightly. Mr. Liang exchanged a glance with his wife. Something quiet passed between them. Something that didn't include Ethan. The distance widened. Ethan felt it. Of course he did. It was no longer subtle. He straightened in his chair, his posture tightening, his presence pushing forward again. Not with ease, but with force. "We're adapting to ensure the best outcome," he said. "That's what professionals do." Naomi translated. Again, clean, unfiltered. Mr. Liang listened, then responded. Short, direct. Naomi turned back to Ethan. "He says," she began, "that consistency is also part of professionalism." The room didn't move. It held. Because this wasn't just conversation anymore. This was evaluation. And Ethan was no longer the one doing it. He leaned forward, both hands flat against the table again. "You're making this sound like instability," he said, his voice lower, controlled, but edged with something sharper now. Naomi met his gaze. "I'm not making it sound like anything," she said. A pause. Then, I'm translating what's being said. The distinction landed harder than anything else she had said to him, because it removed interpretation, removed defense, left only truth. Ethan's eyes flickered, just for a second. Then he leaned back again, slower this time. The fight wasn't gone, but it had changed shape. He couldn't push against her directly. Not anymore. Not without losing more ground. So he shifted, adjusted, recalibrated, the way men like him always did. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and placed it on the table. The movement was deliberate, measured, a new strategy forming. "Let's be clear," he said, his voice steady again, but colder now. "This is a high-level negotiation." Naomi didn't respond. He looked directly at her. Speaking conversational Mandarin, he continued, and understanding the complexities of a formal agreement are two very different things. The words were calm, but they carried intent. Challenge. He slid the phone across the table toward her. On the screen, a document was open, dense, structured, lines of Mandarin characters filling the page. "This," he said, tapping the screen lightly, "is the actual working draft." The room leaned in again, not physically, but in focus. "Read it," Ethan said. "Translate it." A pause. Then, quietly, "Right now." The shift was immediate. The air tightened, because this wasn't a conversation anymore. This was a test. Not casual, not subtle, deliberate, calculated. Ethan wasn't trying to regain control of the moment. He was trying to break it. Naomi looked at the phone. She didn't reach for it right away. The glow of the screen reflected faintly in her eyes. The characters, tight, formal, structured, were nothing like the casual language of conversation. This was something else, something heavier, something precise. Across the room, Derek's shoulders stiffened. Maria's hands tightened together. Mr. Liang didn't interrupt. He didn't stop it. He watched, carefully, because he understood exactly what Ethan was doing and what it might reveal. Naomi reached for the phone, not quickly, not slowly, with the same calm she had carried all night. Her fingers closed around it. She lifted it just enough to read clearly. Her eyes moved across the text, line by line, not scanning, reading. The room held its breath again, because now the question had changed. Not whether Naomi belonged, not whether she understood, but how deep that understanding really went, and whether it could hold under pressure. Ethan watched her closely, waiting, counting, looking for the hesitation, the pause, the crack, anything that would restore the balance he had lost. Naomi didn't speak immediately. She let her eyes move through the document. Let the meaning settle. Let the structure reveal itself. Then she exhaled quietly, and the moment before she spoke felt heavier than anything that had come before, because whatever she said next would either confirm everything the room had begun to believe or break it apart completely. Naomi didn't look up. Not yet. The glow of the phone lit her face softly, the reflection of dense characters flickering across her eyes as she read. Line by line, clause by clause. The restaurant had never been this quiet, not even at closing. It was the kind of silence where you could hear things that were never meant to be noticed. The faint hum of refrigeration behind the bar, the distant creak of a chair shifting weight, the slow melt of ice in a glass. Ethan watched her, unblinking. This was it. This was where reality would correct itself, where skill met its limit, where everything that had tilted away from him would snap back into place. He leaned back slightly, one arm resting on the chair, trying to appear relaxed. but his fingers tapped once against the wood, then stopped. Naomi finished reading the first section. She didn't rush into speaking. She let the words settle inside her, let the structure unfold. Then she lifted her gaze. Not to Ethan, to the table, to everyone. And she began. Clause 1, she said calmly, her voice steady and clear, defines the equity distribution under initial investment conditions. She spoke in English, but the cadence of her explanation carried something deeper. Understanding, not memorization. She broke it down. Simple. Precise. Who held what? Under which conditions? What shifted? What stayed fixed? No hesitation. No searching for words. The room leaned in. Because this wasn't translation anymore. This was comprehension. Ethan's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Just slightly. Naomi continued. Clause 2, she said, addresses liability limitations. She paused briefly, not because she needed to, because the thought required space. There's a discrepancy, she added, between the Mandarin phrasing and the English summary. Mr. Liang's associate straightened. Naomi continued. The Mandarin implies mutual responsibility under certain conditions, she said. But the English version places that weight primarily on one side. She didn't say which. She didn't need to. Everyone at the table understood. Mr. Liang's fingers stilled against the glass. His wife leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Naomi now. Ethan didn't move, didn't interrupt, because he couldn't. Not without confirming something he wasn't ready to admit. Naomi moved on. Clause 3, she said. And this time, she stopped. Just for a second. The pause hit the room like a held breath. Ethan's eyes sharpened. This was it. The hesitation. The crack. The moment he had been waiting for. Naomi's gaze dropped briefly back to the screen. Her thumb adjusted its grip slightly. Then she spoke again. This section, she said slowly, relates to exclusivity. Her tone hadn't changed, but something beneath it had. Something deeper, more precise. The phrasing here, she continued, is ambiguous. Mr. Liang's associate leaned forward further now, his phone forgotten entirely. Naomi's eyes moved across the line again. Then she explained. In standard Mandarin legal structure, she said, this could be interpreted as applying only to subsidiary entities. She paused, then added, but in regional usage, particularly in Shanghai, she looked up, it can extend to individual officers as well. The room didn't just go quiet. It locked. Ethan's fingers pressed harder into the table. Naomi continued. Your English draft, she said, treats it as limited to subsidiaries. A breath. But if interpreted differently, she let the words settle, then finished. It could invalidate the exclusivity clause entirely. Silence. Not restaurant silence, not polite silence. The kind of silence that happens when something irreversible has just been said. Mr. Liang leaned back slowly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, sharp, focused, present. He turned his head slightly toward his associate. They exchanged a look. No words, none needed. Then he looked back at Naomi and nodded. She is correct, he said. The words landed like something final, not loud, but absolute. Ethan didn't move. For a moment, he couldn't. Because this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a detail. This was structural. This was real. And it had just been exposed by her. Across the room, something shifted. A chair scraped softly against the floor. Someone exhaled. A glass was set down with a quiet clink. The tension broke, not into noise, into recognition. Mr. Liang placed his hands flat on the table. Then, slowly, he stood. The movement drew every eye in the room. He didn't speak immediately. He simply looked at Naomi for a long moment. Then, he began to clap. Once, slow, measured. Then again, each clap deliberate, each one echoing just enough to fill the space. His wife stood next, then the associate, then the other, one by one. The table rose, applauding, not loudly, not wildly, but with weight, with meaning. Around the room, people followed, not all at once, but in waves. A couple near the window, the man at the bar, the server who had frozen earlier. Derek stepped forward from the kitchen doorway, his hands coming together slowly. Maria followed, her eyes bright. The sound spread, filling the restaurant, not as noise, as acknowledgement. Naomi stood in the center of it, still, composed, her hands at her sides. She didn't bow, didn't smile, didn't step forward. Because she hadn't done this for them. She had simply told the truth. Ethan remained seated, the only one at the table who didn't stand. His hand tightened around his glass, white knuckles against clear crystal. The applause washed around him, not touching him, not including him. He looked at Naomi, really looked, and for the first time that night, there was no arrogance left in his expression, only realization. Heavy, unavoidable. Naomi glanced down. The $20 bill was still on the floor, exactly where it had been, unmoved. She stepped forward, bent down, picked it up. The room quieted slightly, watching, waiting. She turned, walked to Ethan, and placed the bill gently on the table in front of him. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it carried. "Keep it," she said. A pause. Then, "You need it more than I do. No anger, no edge, just truth." And in that moment, everything that had happened that night settled into place, not with noise, not with celebration, but with a quiet, irreversible clarity. The applause faded slowly, like waves pulling back from the shore. One by one, hands lowered. Chairs creaked softly as people sat back down. But the room didn't return to what it had been. It couldn't. Because something had been seen, something that could not be unseen. Naomi stepped back from the table, not retreating, releasing. The space she had held together all night gently returned to the people sitting in it. Mr. Liang remained standing for a moment longer. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a card. Not rushed, not casual. He held it with both hands and extended it toward her, a gesture of respect, the kind that carried meaning beyond business. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice calm, grounded. "My firm works across several cities. We rely on people who understand more than language." A pause. People who understand people. Naomi looked at the card, then at him. There was no surprise in her expression, only thought. "I would like to speak with you," he continued, "after tonight." The room leaned in again, not with tension, with anticipation. Naomi accepted the card with both hands, a small, natural motion. Respect meeting respect. "Thank you," she said. "Nothing more, nothing less." Across the table, Ethan hadn't moved. The $20 bill sat in front of him, unfolded, unclaimed. Next to it, the weight of everything that had happened pressed in silently. He finally reached for it. Not quickly, not confidently. His fingers lifted the bill, turning it once as if trying to understand how something so small had come to represent something so large. He didn't look at Naomi when he spoke. "I underestimated you," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried. Naomi didn't respond immediately, because the moment didn't belong to apology. It belonged to truth. She met his gaze. "You didn't ask," she said. Simple. Direct. Not cruel, but complete. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, because that was the part that couldn't be argued. Around the room, people shifted. Not uncomfortably, thoughtfully, because that sentence didn't just belong to him. It belonged to everyone who had stayed silent. The woman near the window looked down at her plate. The man at the bar exhaled slowly. Derek lowered his arms, his posture easing, but his eyes still fixed on Naomi. Maria blinked quickly, her expression somewhere between awe and something deeper. Something she would carry with her long after this night. Naomi stepped back another half step, returning fully to herself. Not the center of the room, not the voice of the table. Just Naomi. A waitress in a black apron under warm yellow light, but something had changed. Not in her, in how she was seen. Mr. Liang gave a final nod. Then he sat. The conversation at the table resumed, but not the same way. There was more care now, more listening, more space between words. And this time, no one spoke over anyone else. Naomi turned, not toward the kitchen immediately. She paused for a moment, her hand brushing once more against the pen on her apron. The small, worn object caught the light, a quiet reminder of everything that had been carried into this room, and everything that had finally been seen. She walked away from the table, not dismissed, not ignored, but acknowledged. Behind her, the room slowly returned to motion. Glasses lifted, conversations resumed, but softer. More aware, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer. Then he stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just stood. He adjusted his jacket, glanced once around the room, and walked toward the exit. No one stopped him. No one spoke to him. The space he left behind felt different, lighter, but heavier in meaning. At the door, he paused, just for a second, then stepped out into the night. The glass door closed quietly behind him, and that was it. No final words, no redemption, just consequence. Naomi reached the kitchen. Derek was waiting just inside. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her, then nodded once. Slow, respectful. "You changed the whole room," he said finally. Naomi shook her head slightly. "No," she replied. A small pause. "I just didn't leave it the way I found it." Derek let out a quiet breath, because he understood exactly what she meant. Maria stepped forward next, her voice soft. "I want to learn," she said. Naomi looked at her, really looked. And for a moment, the weight of the night shifted into something else, something lighter, warmer. "You already are," Naomi said. Simple, true. Later, as the night wound down, Naomi stepped outside for a moment. The air was cool, the sound of the bay soft in the distance. She reached into her apron and took out the business card, looked at it, then tucked it back away. Not as a decision, as a possibility. Behind her, through the glass, the restaurant glowed under its amber lights. People moved, talked, laughed. But something in that space had changed. Something quiet. Something lasting. Naomi turned back toward the door. Her reflection caught in the glass for just a second. Then she stepped inside. Back to work. back to the rhythm she knew, but not back to who she had been before. Because tonight had proven something, not just to the room, but to her. That dignity didn't need to be announced. It didn't need permission. And it certainly didn't have a price. It only needed one moment, one voice, one decision not to stay silent, and everything after that
would follow. When Naomi realized that $20 bill back in front of Ethan Caldwell, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand respect. She simply saw the room, what it looked like. And in that quiet moment, every person who stayed silent had to face what they had chosen not to see. The story isn't about language or intelligence. It's about the cost of assuming you already know someone's worth. Because the moment you decide who someone is without asking, you might be standing right in front of someone who could change everything and never even realize it. Next time you meet someone like Naomi, someone working quietly, doing their job without attention, take 1 second and really look at them. Not their role, not their uniform, them. Because sometimes all it takes is one question to uncover a story you never expected. If this story hit you, comment one below. If you ever stay silent in a moment like that, wish you hadn't, comment 0. And before you go, the next story may make you rethink the one person you've been overlooking your whole life.